Good evening. My name is Nick Johnson, and welcome to tonight's SecTalk session. Coming to you from Sydney, online, of course, due to the current situation. SecTalks, just briefly, was originally created in Perth in 2013. It is now more or less all over the world, chapters everywhere, including the UK and many other places in Europe. Let me just try and work out how to change the slide here. It's a non-profit independent community that tries these days to run monthly technical talks and hands-on security channels, for example, capture the flag competitions, which everyone of any skill level is welcome and encouraged to take part. It is sponsored, but there is a rule whereby the sponsors don't really try to sell anything. They may advertise job vacancies they have, but that's about as far as that goes. There are our sponsors, so thanks to them. As always, thankful for their support, for their ongoing support, always appreciated. Here are some of our links. As you can see, we're always happy to take papers and speakers. There are the sponsorship, the email for the sponsorship to inquire about sponsorship, capture the flag. All these links are available on our website. So anytime you feel like reaching out and talking to us about any of these options, please do so. We're a very friendly bunch. After tonight's chat, unfortunately, we won't be networking in person. We hope to be doing that very, very soon. But we will be hanging around the YouTube channel and the Slack channel, where you can ask any and all questions. Please ask your questions at any point during the talk. Don't wait until the end. Just pop them in the YouTube chat or the Slack channel chat, and we will see them come through our portal, and we will be answering them as we go along. And with that, I will move you on.
Well, thanks, Nick. Let me start by shortly introducing the presentation. So this will be different from the talk that we had last time, which was quite low level. And this time we are going to move to a completely different subject, which I think this is the first time we are talking about it, and that's to do with election security. This is, again, one of the first talks that there's a team of people who have done research and created the content that our speaker will go through. Just to re-emphasize, you can use the YouTube chat as always, and the SecTalks Sydney chat channel to ask your questions. And please do so as we go through the talk, because there is nothing more unusual than talking to the screen. Either 14-inch or 15-inch doesn't make any difference. So please get your question come through, and we will present them to our speaker. Our speaker also is able to see them as she will go through the talk. So what about the talk? And our speaker going to demystify some interesting aspects regarding to the way that in Australia we vote. And apparently we just don't vote on paper. There are many other mechanisms being used. She will start with a survey of the election software used in Australia. And apparently there are quite a few of them, interesting. And she will also start listing out the bugs. I believe some of them will be security bugs and cryptographic errors that her team have found over the years in their systems, internet voting, and electronic counting softwares. And she will also discussing the recently discovered bug in the ACT's counting code, which if you have anyone from Canberra or ACT, I think that would be something that you might want to think about. I don't know about NSW. I'm keen to hear about that as well. And finally, she will conclude the talk with some solutions describing new techniques for risk limiting audits of the paper ballots in preferential elections. Now, the talk is by Associate Professor Vanessa Teague, and this is a joint work. And please bear with me to go through the name of all the people who have been involved and we have listed in our meetup page. So that would be Michelle Blom, and please forgive my ignorance if I pronounce some names incorrectly. Andrew Conway, Chris Colonnane, Alex Essex, Thomas Haynes, Alex Helderman, Sarah Jamie Lewis, Olivier Pirevia, Philip Stark, Peter Stokey, and finally Damian Vukocevic. Vanessa is a CEO of Thinking Security and Associate Professor in Research Council of Computer Science at ANU, Australian National University. His research primarily focuses on cryptographic method for achieving security and privacy, particularly for issues of public interest, including election. And her team is the team who has discovered the easy re-identification of doctors and patients, and that easy keyword makes me a bit worried that why it was that easy in the Medicare open data set released by Australian Department of Health. Currently, she lives and works in Wurundjeri land, which is in the southern eastern of Australia. So with all these things, please join me to welcome Vanessa to our virtual stage. Vanessa, all yours.
Okay, thanks, Pedro. Thanks very much for that introduction, and thanks for inviting me. This is not really a very technical talk. It's more of a survey of, an opinionated survey of Australian electronic election conduct. Just for a little bit about me, I started off, I trained as a cryptographer, and I started off getting interested in elections when I started looking at sophisticated cryptographic methods of proving that you'd got the right answer. But after years and years of research in this field, I increasingly believe that actually the simple methods are the best. And so I'm going to show you a little bit about what's happening in Australian elections. I conducted, whoops, let me advance my slides. Okay, I conducted a completely thorough scientific survey of Australian understanding of electronic election conduct. Actually, I kind of wanted to, but I didn't have time. So I just copied and pasted some people who trolled me on Twitter. Not really, but they trolled me. This is a very common misconception. Everybody thinks that all Australian ballots are cast on paper and counted by hand. And indeed, if you say they're not, people will tell you off on Twitter. Like most common misconceptions, it has a nugget of truth. It's certainly the case that all our House of Representatives ballots are cast on paper and counted by hand, and that's great. So if you wanted to interfere with the process by which the Australian Prime Minister is chosen, you'd have to interfere with some paper ballots and or with the process of counting them by hand in the presence of scrutineers. And I think that's pretty hard. So that part of the process is pretty good. However, that's only one part of Australian elections. The Senate ballots, which are paper in which you fill in with a pencil, are actually electronically scanned and counted. The first preferences are counted by hand, but all of the subsequent preferences are entirely electronically input. Likewise for most of our state parliaments, upper houses, and the paper ballots in the ACT. In New South Wales state elections, about 5% of the vote come off an internet voting system. And in the Australian Capital Territory for their Legislative Assembly elections, about 80% of votes are cast on a computer in a polling place that doesn't have any kind of paper record at all. There's also a bunch of phone voting, email voting, and a whole lot of other things that I'm not going to talk about in detail. But the rest of this talk is going to consist of looking at each of these three case studies, one at a time, and they're roughly arranged in order of priority for Australian security. And I'm going to look at each one, think about how it could be attacked, give you a high-level view of what its defences are, and then talk about what we need to do to defend it. Here's the AEC's diagram, the Australian Electoral Commission's diagram of how the Australian Senate scanning and counting process works. So on the left-hand side, you can see ballot papers coming in, and they're automatically scanned through some just more or less generic scanning machines, which do some automated optical character recognition. Then as we move a little bit across the page, you can see, depending on exactly what happens with the automated scanning process, there's some manual oversight, some human oversight of some parts of the process. And you can see these squares that are marked data entry number 1 and data entry number 2 are done by a person who's looking at an image on the screen that's been captured by the scanner. Then there's some comparisons, some interpretation of what happens, some opportunity to reconcile the possibility if the preferences are expressed differently and resolve any inconsistencies. The end of this process, kind of one step before the little counting box at the end, is literally a great big CSV file, which has, for each paper ballot, a complete list of its digitized preferences as interpreted by this system, which they actually publish on the internet. So you can do the final step yourself independently, and we have, and double check the actual count itself, which takes the complete list of everybody's preferences and turns them into a list of senators who won. What you can't check yourself is whether or not the electronic digitized preferences accurately match the paper ballots. And that to me is the key security problem with this system. We just don't know how closely the electronic preferences that are actually counted correspond to the paper ballots that we all voted on. So I'm not the first person to point out that this might be a problem. Here is the transcript from the Joint Standing Committee on Electoral Matters in 2019. Senator Larissa Waters is asking, what's the estimate of the error rate of the digitisation process? And you can see at the very bottom, the Electoral Commissioner says, I might just take that on notice. Right, so she's not asking about security, she's not asking about the possibility of malicious interference with the process, she's just asking, on a good day, in a controlled setting, what's the estimate of the error rate of that process we just saw? She didn't get an answer, or she didn't get a clear answer. Here's another transcript from Senate estimates, March of this year. A different senator says, I understand your software was approved by IBM and that the error rate they estimated was below 0.5%. Is that correct? What was your error rate in 2019? And again, the Electoral Commissioner says, I don't know. Now note that he's not being asked an equivalent question about a new election. There hasn't been an election in the intervening year and a half. He's being asked exactly the same question that Larissa Waters asked him, and he still doesn't know. Now, just as a little aside, I hope it amuses you all that there are not really very many issues on which Larissa Waters and Senator Roberts are both asking the same questions. And I think it's a great thing for Australian democracy that across the political spectrum, lots of different people care about election integrity. I wish more people did, because it's really important. So taking a question on notice doesn't mean that you don't have to answer it. I'm going to show you the answer in a second. But just have a think about what the answer is meant to be, right? You're a bunch of geeks. You can see that it's a question that asks for a numerical answer, right? He's asking for an estimate of the error rate, and the answer is a number, right? It's a number which may or may not be below 0.5%. And like any good numerical answer, we might hope that it would come with an explanation of how it was computed. Right, so we're expecting an answer roughly of the form, well, Senator, the error rate is X%, and we computed that by randomly sampling Y paper ballots and comparing them with the digitised preferences, and we noted Z errors. What we actually get is this. It's very, very long. I know that you can't read it. I sort of fitted it all on one slide to emphasize how long it was rather than to give you an opportunity to read it. It doesn't actually say anything. And it notably does not include an actual number, although it asserts that the actual number is below 0.05%. It never gives you any details about why they think that or how they came to that conclusion. If you have very sharp eyes, you might be able to see a couple of zeros in the text. Don't be confused. Neither of those zeros have anything to do with the error rate of the digitisation process. So as a democracy, if we want to know how secure or accurate is the process by which our Senate ballots are scanned and digitised, we just can't extract that information. It doesn't matter how carefully we ask. And note that we're only asking, these senators are only asking the question in the most generous possible case of a controlled experiment on a good day at the Electoral Commission where they have a go at scanning some things and make a public observation. We haven't even tried to scratch below the surface and ask about the potential for deliberate manipulation or surreptitious alteration of the data, either at the input step or the output step. But it got better, actually. So this is from the same Senate estimates hearing in March. The Electoral Commissioner went on to say, what we've got is a manual count and a scanning process. The results of those are compared. Now, depending on how much you've already obsessed about the Australian Senate count, you may or may not realise that if you were to count it manually, the full distribution of preferences process would run to potentially hundreds of rounds. So big states like Victoria and New South Wales have millions of votes, 3 or 4 million of votes, and a state is counted as one electorate. You have to count all of the votes at once in order to know which candidates you're supposed to eliminate and who gets a seat and how to redistribute them. And because of the specific details of the way that Senate ballots are counted in particular, you can actually have more rounds of elimination than you have a total candidates on the ballot. And the total candidates on the ballot in a bad year can be well over 100. So it is almost certainly not feasible to count the Senate ballots manually. I'm sure that they do not have a manual count. In fact, I doubt that there's been a manual count this century. And yet here we are in a formal parliamentary setting claiming that there is one. There just isn't one. There's a manual count of first preferences, which really is a genuine manual count, and that's great. But it doesn't tell us anything about the subsequent preference redistribution, and that subsequent preference redistribution often determines at least some seats in most states. So let's have a look at what we do know and think about what the opportunities for either accidental software or configuration bugs or deliberate fraud might be. This is a copy of that same diagram that I showed you a few slides ago. This one comes from the Australian National Audit Office and their report into the Senate scanning and counting system. Now, they call it a simplified diagram, but they've actually added an important little detail that isn't in the AAC diagram I showed you, which is they've looked at which parts of the process are administered by the ICT supplier and which ones are operated by the AAC. So if you think about the possibility of either bugs or malicious manipulation, you can see that there's a great deal of concentration of power here. And if, for example, there was some kind of a bug in the data entry software, which accidentally switched a certain kind of a number into a certain other kind of a number, it seems from this diagram that both of those pieces of software were supplied by the same company anyway. So even though there is a little bit of human oversight at a little part of the project, a little part of the process here in the data entry numbers, that is nothing resembling a manual count. It is not manual because the people are not looking at the paper ballot, they're looking at the electronic scan. And it's not a count because they're not retaining any sort of record that's independent of the software system that we're trying to test anyway. In short, I think there's a very serious concern that if there was a bug or a security problem in this software, that it could potentially alter the later preferences after the first preferences in a way that could change the election results, but would not necessarily be detected by this process. So what can we do about it? In my opinion, based on both research and practice in the United States, the right way to deal with this problem is to audit not any particular details of the process, but the whole effectiveness and correctness of the process from the beginning in, from the input to the output. And the idea ought to be that we take a random selection of paper ballots, we find the corresponding record in the giant CSV file of preferences, and in the presence of scrutineers, we go and carefully check how many discrepancies there are between what everybody can see on the piece of paper and what everybody has been shown to be the case on the CSV file. It's normal for there to be some discrepancies, and it's not evidence of electoral fraud. It happens all the time. It happens in the United States and they deal with it. But it needs to be done so that we have an idea of what the error rate actually is. And the crucial part about this is that the audit process would be a public process in the presence of scrutineers that let the scrutineers see what was on the paper ballots as they were audited. I am not making this up. This is a thing that is commonly practiced in the United States and in fact is required by law in some of the more enlightened American states. Many American states, including California and I think Colorado, mandate a risk limiting audit after their paper ballots are counted with electronic scanning. And so the definition is here on the slide. In a system with an electronic counting of paper votes, a risk limiting audit provides rigorous statistical evidence that the announced election outcome is right, or if the evidence isn't convincing or if it finds an error rate that's relatively high, a risk limiting audit reverts to a full hand count. Now that's the case in the US. Honestly, I don't know what we would do if we audited the Senate ballots and found that there was a high rate of error because, as I said, I don't think a full hand count is really feasible. I think we just have to go through them one at a time and make sure that the electronic record really did match the paper. With Michelle Blom and Peter Stuckey and Damien Vukovic and Philip Stark, we've done a lot of work, and Andrew Conway, we've done a lot of work developing new techniques for rigorous risk-limiting audits of preferential elections. We started doing it with the expectation that it would be used in Australia. It's never been used in Australia, but although Australia has never adopted risk-limiting audits, America has started to adopt preferential voting in the Australian style. This is a picture of a pilot we ran in the San Francisco District Attorney's race. We conducted a pilot risk-limiting audit for various stupid engineering reasons. We were only able to conduct the audit on the postal votes, not on the whole election. So we kind of we acted as if we were we acted as if the postal votes were the whole election and we audited just them. But we were able to show that the whole process was very feasible and could be conducted on an election at that scale. It was the first time that a rigorous risk-limiting audit of preferential, they call it instant runoff voting in the United States, had ever been conducted. The nice thing about it is, I'm not sure if this is still true, but it was certainly true at the time, that the code for actually conducting the election was proprietary and not available for scrutiny in San Francisco. So just like the Australian Senate code, it was completely hidden from view. Nobody really knew what it was doing or who wrote it or anything. I believe it was a Dominion system, I'm not 100% sure. And I'm not sure who provided the Australian Senate system either. But all the code for doing the audit is completely openly available. And you can see here the references to Michelle Blom's code on GitHub so Michelle's code does the parts of it that are specific to preferential voting, and that is instant runoff voting. And Philip Stark's code does the statistics for the actual risk limiting audit. And a paper all about it is up there on archive. So even if the software vendor and the Electoral Commission want to keep the actual conduct of the code for actually conducting the election secret, we can still do the audit of the paper ballots against the output of that process in a completely publicly verifiable way. So could we do this in the Australian Senate? Yes and no is sort of the answer. We don't actually have a complete method for risk limiting audits of the complex single transferable vote count. It's an open problem, an interesting one that we're working on, but we don't know how to do yet. The maths is hard. However, we could do some kind of open audit that would give us some kind of evidence about the rate of error in that system, and either tell us that the rate of error was low enough not to have made a difference, or possibly tell us that the rate of error was high enough that we needed to investigate more carefully. I think this is critically important. I think we just have to do it. And I think that if the Electoral Commission doesn't want to do it voluntarily, the Parliament should legislate to make it happen. This takes me to, this is the end of my first section. I might pause for a minute to see if anybody's got a burning question about it. And then I'll move on to my second thing. Silence. What's the threshold for the error rate that would render the counting invalid? Okay, this is an excellent question. How do we know what error rate is small enough? And the answer is, it depends. It's actually extremely hard to compute in general. So remember back when the 1,300 West Australian Senate ballots went missing? And initially, the Electoral Commission was saying that that wasn't enough to make a difference, because the final margin, when we looked at the last couple of people who got a seat, was larger than that. It turned out, however, and some of, I think it was Graham Bowland and some other clever people in the Greens figured out that if you went back a little way and altered one of the earlier steps in the elimination sequence, that actually cascaded into a completely different election outcome, and that was a much smaller margin. So the answer is, we don't know. In general, you can usually find an upper bound by example. In other words, you can usually look at the outcome and say, well, if I'd been able to change those 200 votes, that could produce a different outcome. It's much harder in general to go the other way around and say with any confidence that the minimum number of changes necessary to alter the outcome would have been such and such. That's a large part of the reason that risk limiting audits for this kind of election are still open, by the way. Has Dr. Teague received any support from the cybersecurity CRC? I assume you're joking. No, I haven't. Okay. What is classified as an error? A discrepancy between what's written on the paper ballot and what's written in the electronic file for the preferences that correspond to that ballot.
I got one question in regarding to that pilot that you did in San Francisco. How did you measure the success of that pilot?
Yes, okay, that's a really good question. Because, I mean, in some ways, the real test of a successful election auditing method is, if the election was manipulated, did you notice, right? And in this case, the election was not manipulated. So at least we're fairly confident it was not manipulated. So we didn't get to make that practical test. What we did test was the feasibility of reaching quite a high level of statistical confidence based on a relatively small sample of ballots. So we sampled about 200 ballots, paper ballots. We looked at them. It turned out actually there were very, very few discrepancies. The process was very accurate, and we're able to calculate that the probability that the outcome had been manipulated in that case was correspondingly very low. So in some sense, that's a success in the sense that it shows that the method is very feasible, and you can be very confident based on not very much auditing. We have not yet had the opportunity to test our method on an election that has been manipulated and has got the wrong answer, but maybe one day we'll get a chance. How would publicly available verifications account for the chain of custody of the ballot? That's also an excellent question, and the answer is they wouldn't, right? So absolutely, it doesn't obviate the need to maintain the physical security of the paper ballots. You can only check that the check against them is only as good as the security of them in the first place. That's a really good question and a good point. Okay, I'm going to move on to the next thing, but if you've got any more questions about this section, we can come back at the end. Okay, next section. I'm going to talk a little bit about iVote. I'm not going to talk very much about iVote because I've talked a lot about iVote many times in the past. But just in case you don't know, the New South Wales iVote system took about 5% of the votes in the 2019 New South Wales state election, and approximately similar percentage in the previous New South Wales state election as well. In order to explain what iVote is and what it isn't, it's actually best to start with what I would regard as a sort of idealized verifiable voting picture. And this is partly by way of example, by way of answer to the people who asked on the chat before the talk whether a blockchain would solve the problem of secure online voting. Here's kind of an idealized high-level picture of what an ideal fancy cryptographic verifiable voting system would look like. I'd start off on the left. Voters would be encrypting their own vote with some device or piece of software, and they'd have a completely independent piece of software under their own control that they could use to verify whether the ciphertext that they made accurately reflected their intentions. Then I would stick all of the votes on some kind of public bulletin board so that everybody could check that their vote was there and everybody knew that they were all looking at the same election transcript. Then I would have a series of mix servers which would shuffle the ciphertexts. That is, they would re-encrypt the ciphertexts and rearrange them in such a way that they broke the link between the inputs that had come from voters that we knew and the eventual outputs that were going to be decrypted. And about 10 years of my research life has been spent studying fancy cryptographic protocols for this series, the process of shuffling and decrypting electronic votes in such a way that you can prove that even the people administering the election didn't cheat. In other words, you can take a list of encrypted ciphertexts and another list of encrypted ciphertexts and construct a zero-knowledge proof that shows that you have the same set of plain texts, even though they've been rearranged, and you have decrypted them honestly, even though you're not going to tell anybody the decryption key. So heaps of academic literature about this. It's very interesting, but I'm not going to talk about it today. What I am going to talk about is what solves this problem and what doesn't. So in answer to the people who asked whether a blockchain would solve the secure voting problem, you can certainly imagine fitting a blockchain into a little part of this process, right? And using the blockchain as the bulletin board. But the blockchain doesn't inherently solve actually any of the hard parts of this process. It doesn't give us a way for voters to verify that their votes accurately reflect their intentions. It doesn't give us an automatic way of protecting privacy. It doesn't necessarily give us an automatic way of verifying that the votes have been properly dealt with after they've been cast. So perhaps it's a small part of the solution, but it's definitely not an overall solution to the whole problem. And furthermore, your blockchain isn't impossible to manipulate, right? It's hard to manipulate under a certain set of assumptions, But if the reward for messing around is that you get to tilt a New South Wales state election one way or the other, then maybe the consensus, maybe it's too easy to buy a majority of stake or a majority of doable work for that blockchain. So this is hard, and even the in principle perfect cryptographic system has a series of suboptimal features that we haven't solved, right? We haven't solved voter authentication. We haven't stopped people proving how they voted. We haven't made it usable for normal people and so forth. So let's talk about iVote, because iVote falls a long way short of this ideal. First of all, let's think about the voter end. Voters use some JavaScript from SecTalks to vote through their browser. Then they use a different closed source app from the same software vendor to verify that their vote was encoded in the way they wanted. Even the New South Wales Parliament observed that this is not a great situation, because if you didn't trust the company that was writing the voting system in the first place, why would you trust them to verify that they'd told the truth and encoded your vote properly in the first place? So I trust that the shortcomings of this protocol are probably pretty obvious. At the time of the election, none of the source code was available except under an NDA that obliged you to keep your findings secret for 5 years, which I refused to sign. 4 months after the election, some of the code, in fact, pretty much all of the code actually, was made available under a fairly reasonable non-disclosure agreement. Here's a bit more detail about how it works. Closed source verification app, we've already discussed. The bulletin board is not public. The set of received votes is secret, only insiders can see. So you can't really check in any kind of meaningful way that everybody's looking at the same election transcript as you. It has a single mix server, which sort of completely defeats the point of having a mix server at all, right? Because the whole point of having a series of mixers is that each one of them obscures the link between their inputs and outputs, and then the whole series of them has to collude together to recreate the connection between an incoming vote and the outgoing decrypted vote. If you've only got one, it can recreate that connection itself. There were supposed to be proofs of honest mixing and decryption, but we found that they were unsound after looking at the openly available Swiss code, which came from the same vendor and contained the same cryptographic proofs. This is somewhat old news. You can look at the link if you like. There's a whole talk's worth of fancy crypto about exactly what was wrong with these proofs. I assume that if you wanted to know, you probably heard about it already. But the bottom line is that the proof that the system had properly mixed and properly decrypted without adding or substituting votes was actually unsound, and it was possible to provide what seemed like a valid proof, which passed the verification algorithm, but actually allowed for manipulation of the vote. Now, we're not saying there was manipulation of the vote. We have absolutely no evidence that anything did actually go wrong, but we showed that the method of proving that nothing had gone wrong was flawed. So that kind of sums up iVote. I'm going to skip on to the next section because I'm coming close to the end of time, but questions about iVote are always welcome. Third section. Okay, so in the ACT, so the ACT has its own legislative assembly, which is sort of halfway between a local council and a real parliament, but it's a real parliament in a way. For this legislative assembly, 80% of votes are cast on a paperless pollsite electronic voting system. This photo is taken from the ABC, and you can't see all that clearly, but these people are voting on a touch screen, right? So they walk into the polling station, a familiar, controlled environment. They sign off, and then instead of filling out a paper ballot in a voting box, they express their preferences on a touch screen. There's no paper printout, there's no meaningful verification of any kind. We don't really know anything about it. We don't really know anything about it at all. It used to be open source. In fact, it was open source for the best part of 20 years. It's not a new system, or rather, it's not a new idea, But as of 2020, they spontaneously decided to re-implement it from scratch and hide the code behind a confidentiality agreement, the terms of which are certainly were not acceptable to me the last time I looked at them. T. Wilson Brown found some serious privacy problems in 2018, so that is with the 2016 code that was, and still is in fact, openly available. And they wrote them up, told the Electoral Commissioner about them. We hope they've been fixed in the new version, but obviously we can't actually check because we don't have access to the code. What we do know is that the counting code was buggy. So again, there's, perhaps I should have said more clearly at the beginning, there's actually 3 different pieces of code that are relevant to this talk, used in ACT elections. One is the voting code that you saw a minute ago. One is the counting code that translates the votes into the set of people who win a seat in the Legislative Assembly, which is non-trivial because it's quite a complicated STV count, a bit like the Senate. And then the third piece of code, which I'll talk about in a second, is the Internet voting code. So let's look at what happened. What happened was Andrew Conway re-implemented the ACT counting algorithm based on looking carefully at the legislation, and he reran the count based on the digitised ballots which they put up online, which is a combination of the 80% that are cast directly through a computer and 20% that are cast on paper and scanned and digitised in a process a fair bit like the Senate. So Andrew reruns the whole thing and notices that there are substantial discrepancies between his count and the official count online in the ACT. Initially, the Electoral Commission denied that this was a problem, and but as of March 2021, they have now fixed it. So you can see on this slide the comparison between the tallies of the ACT Greens candidate, Emma Davidson, on the left-hand side as they were at election time in October 2020, and on the right-hand side as they were quietly corrected in March of this year. And you can see that she's gained about 16 votes. I mean, she won a seat anyway. It didn't make any difference to who won, but it made a substantial difference to some tallies, and the algorithmic nature of the error was certainly enough that it could have made a difference to who won if the votes had happened to be different. It's just good luck that it didn't make a difference on this particular occasion. So that's okay, right? Because we can look independently at that software and we can compare its inputs with its outputs, and we can identify when its outputs are not the correct output for those inputs. But we haven't got a clue what really happens with the voting software, which is actually much more critically important, because if it malfunctions when somebody taps on the touch screen, it actually changes the inputs to the voting process. And there's really no way that anybody has an opportunity to detect that problem. There's also an internet voting system, don't know anything about it. T. Wilson Brown got a bit of information out under FOI, and all I can say is it more or less speaks for itself. So here's the section in which they describe encryption of the vote. It says, encryption will be implemented as follows: via TLS for all transmissions between the client and the server. Great. Good. Via SHA-2 of each vote before submission to the votes database on a polling place, telephone, or data entry server. I have absolutely no idea what that means. The ISM specifically states that data already encrypted should not be encrypted again. Hence, there is no need to encrypt messages between the client and the server. Honestly, I have no idea what that means. And I really hope that the people who wrote the code knew a little bit more about it than the people who wrote that paragraph. But since that paragraph is really all we know about privacy protection for votes, the news does not look good. All right, so in summary, if we take the whole collection of all of the software we know about in Australia and my opinionated little selection of the 3 things that I regard as the most dangerous at present. Electronic voting in a polling place is feasible. We could have a system in which everybody went into a polling place and interacted with a computer, but it has to be accompanied with a paper record of the person's vote that they can verify for themselves and make sure that it accurately reflects the vote they intended to cast. And then that paper record has to be treated with some kind of rigorous audit to check it against the electronic vote that is later counted for that person. If we don't have a person checking that their vote is cast as they intended, and an audit that checks that the counted vote matches the thing that the voter checked, then there's an opportunity for software errors or deliberate security or deliberate manipulation to alter the election outcome. There are more sophisticated techniques for end-to-end verifiable elections that don't necessarily print just a plain paper ballot, but Australia is so far away from being able to do that tolerably well that I think the right thing for us to do now is just have a plain paper ballot. Really doing practical verifiable elections over the internet is an unsolved problem. And even in countries like Estonia that have a much more solid digital ID system than ours and a much more simple voting system than ours, I think it's highly debatable whether the security of that system is up to the threats against that system. For us, I just don't think we know how to do that properly. Finally, the Senate count at present provides no evidence whatsoever of its accuracy, and it urgently needs to be updated with a rigorous public audit of the paper ballots. So that's my conclusion. I'm going to open to questions about any of that, which are very welcome. How is the identity of the voters verified in iVote? It has changed a little bit over the years. In the first few rounds of iVote, you just had to know the name and address, possibly the date of birth, I'm not sure. In more recent times, remember that I'm not actually eligible to use it. So I actually can't do the verification part because I am not an eligible voter. I live in Victoria. There has been language on the website that suggests you are encouraged to scan your passport or driver's license or provide your Medicare number. I'm not actually sure whether you can register without that, or exactly what happens if you try to register and you don't have those documents. Thanks, Sandra. Sandra just wrote a nice thing thanking me. More input is always welcome. Other people are also very welcome to take an interest. I think the more people who take an interest, the harder it becomes to just kind of pretend that everything's okay. I think that the ultimate aim here is that a large group of citizens pay enough attention that we can get some change in some of the transparency that demonstrates the accuracy of these systems. So Robert's just written, I encourage you to present this talk at Aussie security conferences if you haven't already. Suggestions are very welcome. Yeah, I'm certainly keen to explain to other people. And if you would like to make some specific suggestions, I'm all ears.
Well, thanks so much, Vanessa. I think it was very insightful. By the way, we still have time for questions. So if anyone has any question, please send us through. Yeah, I was quite interested in the technicality of some of those systems that you assessed. My first question is, I'm sure there should be some sort of open source solution for some of these systems, right? Some protocols, at least, some the things that you also your team was developed. Is there anything in those lines?
There are some really nice open source verifiable internet voting systems. My favorite is the Helios internet voting system, which the International Association of Cryptologic Researchers uses. It's really nice. It's really simple. It does, it uses some very simple homomorphic cryptography for adding up the votes without exposing how individual votes were counted. Sorry, without exposing individual votes, right? So you get this kind of nice cryptographic proof of the proper tally without showing individuals. It's really cool. It's been used in practice for a bunch of elections for university presidents and student societies and stuff. The big gaps that it still has, which I think would make it not okay for Australian elections, even apart from the fact that it only works for simple kind of first past the post elections, not for preferential voting. First of all, it still doesn't solve the remote authentication problem. Secondly, it's actually very hard to use. If you really want to make sure that your vote has been accurately counted, you have to go through a, not complicated, but you have to do a proper job of a non-trivial process for challenging the ciphertext that you've made. It's actually really cool, right? You ask your computer to make a ciphertext, maybe you ask it to make a few ciphertexts, and then you say, actually, I want you to prove to me that you made this one and this one and this one accurately, and then I'm going to cast the other one. So this is quite cool, but a person kind of needs to understand what they're doing and do it with some care in order to get the assurance that they need. And then the worst thing about it is that it allows you to prove how you voted. Well, this is just sort of a known fact about systems with this structure, that if you make a ciphertext and post it on a public bulletin board, which you kind of have to do if you're going to expect to be able to produce any kind of public transcript that proves that the election outcome is right, that makes it too easy for somebody to prove what's in the ciphertext that they posted. So I think there are nice open source academic systems that show us some optimal points on the set of trade-offs, but I don't think any of these systems solve the internet voting problem in a way that we would need it to be solved for government elections.
I mean, it's quite interesting, at the same time worrying that up until now, you're saying even our academic version of these systems don't really solve all the issues. So there hasn't been any work or even a pilot program just to test one of those systems that academically is proven to work, at least see it in real practice that it does its job or not.
So I worked on a project in Victoria many years ago. It was called vVote, and it was an end-to-end verifiable polling place cryptographic voting system. And it was designed to be used in scenarios like the Australian High Commission in London or the embassy in Hong Kong or something like that, where a lot of Australian citizens would come into a supervised polling place and vote on a computer, and then their vote would be electronically transferred back to Melbourne for voting, for counting. And the idea was it used a whole lot of the techniques from years of research to give the voters evidence that their vote had been properly recorded, and then it gave them a bulletin board, which was really just a fancy website on which they could look up their vote and check that it had been properly included into the count. So that remains, as far as I know, the only use. It was at the time the first use of an end-to-end verifiable voting system in a state election. And I don't know that there has been another one since, actually. It was discontinued by the Victorian Electoral Commission because I think it was just too technically difficult. Right? It was complicated. They didn't understand it. They not only didn't understand the maths, they kind of didn't understand the point. And they much preferred the sort of simpler systems that the commercial vendors were selling them, which sort of said, it comes with a glossy pamphlet that tells everybody it's perfectly secure and you don't have to do any of this silly verification stuff. So to them, it seemed like a huge win right? They buy something simple, they just kind of plug it in and run it, and it doesn't even attempt to provide a public transcript that shows people that it got the right answer.
That's worrying. Before I ask more questions, we got one more here. From
what about missing paper ballots or ballot box stuffing? It seems you need to randomly audit voter intent versus functionality. Yeah, so this is a good question, right? The question is basically, and somebody pointed this out earlier in the piece as well, what happens if the paper ballots are messed with? And it's a serious question. To some extent, I guess the cryptography and statistics work is all about what happens, what you can do to test stuff, assuming that the paper trail is okay. But if the paper trail is not okay, I don't know what you can do. I think one thing that I would really like to retain in Australia, and preferably do more of, is the manual count in the polling place at the time, right? That's a really good process. So you show up in the morning, you count the paper ballots. Sorry, you show up in the morning, you show the scrutineers that the box is empty. This is a part of the process. It's even written into legislation in some, at least in Victoria, and I think in some other places. Right, scrutineers are allowed to show up in the morning and see that the ballot box is empty before they start. They're allowed to watch the whole process for the whole day. And then, at least for some of our elections, the two-party preferred count is then done in the polling place on the spot. That's a really good process. The sad thing, of course, in modern Australia is that that process does not anymore correspond to the majority of votes. But there are votes cast in person earlier than voting day, which I actually think is fine, as long as there are scrutineers present and they keep a record of what the numbers were. And there are votes cast over post, which is really not a good way of voting and should be discouraged whenever possible, in my opinion. So we do definitely have this problem that you identify, which is, well, what if something's gone wrong with the paper ballots that we didn't see? And I think the answer is we should actually work really hard to make sure that the rest of the electoral process, as much as possible, make sure that the paper ballot process can be scrutinised.
Would you mind to go to the slides where you had, I think it was in iBot's part, that you had this public bulletin.
Yes.
Now, is this coming from any known protocol, or is it like a thing that?
Is this coming from any known protocol? So, no, not really. So I guess I had a rough idea of the Helios protocol in mind. But actually, Helios does not use mixing. It uses, as I said, homomorphic addition to just add up simple votes. But if you wanted to tack preferential voting onto a system like Helios, you would do this kind of mixing thing. So no, this is not any particular protocol. This is just sort of the distilled rough idea from 15 years of fancy crypto voting.
Right. Okay. So I mean, my thought was, okay, has anyone scrutinized the protocol itself just to figure out, okay, is the concept of that public bulletin board, I mean, is safe enough to include it there? There could be some stuff related to that, and what sort of threat actors you have, what sort of risk you're trying to protect, and do you have enough? So at quite a protocol level, not so much implementation, then later on we can look at the code. So that's a reference that someone can go and dig in more on this.
Yes, the answer is yes. There's heaps of work trying to formalize what the proper properties of this public bulletin board would be. In fact, I've just spent quite a lot of time working with a bunch of other Swiss researchers are looking at what kind of properties would be necessary for the Swiss system to be enhanced with a public bulletin board. And the answer to your question is it kind of depends what the protocol wants from the bulletin board. So at the very least, we need this property that everybody is looking at the same thing. This is sort of the crucial defining property of this component, because we want it to be the case that I can look and see whether my ciphertext is on the bulletin board, and you can look and see whether your ciphertext is on the bulletin board. And then we can all check some kind of proof about the proper tallying of all the ciphertexts. And it's absolutely critical that the bulletin board, should it be malevolent, cannot show you a version of the tally in which your vote is included and me a different version of the tally in which my vote is included, but then actually just drop some of them when it actually does the tally. So it has to be a broadcast in the sense that it has to be somehow guaranteed that everybody is looking at the same version of history. And if you are familiar with the attempts to model the security properties of blockchain consensus protocols, you will see that this is obviously a very similar sounding thing. But if you start thinking about it, try to think about detailing the properties a little bit more. The kind of eventual consensus that most blockchain protocols have is actually not good enough for us here. We need to have consensus at a particular point, which is probably when polls close or possibly when the election result gets finalised or something. You know, we need to know that we looked at it right then, and when we looked at it, everybody was looking at the same thing. The other thing that we need is non-erasure. In other words, we want it to be the case that if I post my ballot and then I look to check that my ballot is there, a malicious bulletin board can't subsequently remove my vote and then make a tally of everybody else's vote. And again, this kind of non-removability property you can see as, again, being familiar from the blockchain universe as well. But again, we want a very strong version of it because, of course, you know that if you own 51% of the compute power or a large fraction of the stake, you can alter history with most of your sort of generic blockchain-based consensus protocols. So it's clearly somewhat similar. There is a fair criticism in the crypto literature that a lot of the cryptographic voting protocols require very, very strong idealized properties out of the bulletin board that may not actually be all that feasible in practice. Yeah, it's an interesting area.
Oh, yeah, it is indeed. And I mean, in terms of, I guess, one of the factors in any of these systems you are exploring is obviously there's going to be general public going to use the system, and all this concept that they should know where to look, what to look to verify, and that need to be really simplified for them, right? You know, someone with a blockchain background is very different with someone which, you know, hasn't even used, you know, iPad. So how do you, I mean, what is your thoughts on those sort of problems that whether the verification process that they were told or the awareness of those users to check whether they're actually doing the right thing? And the other thing is, if all these systems that little bit implementation, what is like more browser based, how would you foresee that, you know, you can, if someone seeing the thing on the screen is actually what it is, it's nothing in the middle, modified it and things like that. It's quite a lot of things going on, yeah?
Yeah, I agree very much. And that's really where I've got to after, you know, more than a decade of research in this field. I love the maths, but actually as a solution to real voting problems, I'm actually less and less convinced that this is actually a realistic solution to running government elections for exactly the reasons that you describe, right? I think if we needed to have a rigorous, secure election in which computers were enfranchised to vote, I think we would have nailed that. We've nailed that. We know how to do that. What we don't know how to do is make the verification process sufficiently usable that we can be confident that normal people actually used it properly and actually had a chance of detecting when there was a problem.
Yeah, cool. Got one more question before I continue.
Any unsupervised ML methods used to identify errors? Honestly, I have no idea. You mean in the electronic scanning and counting system for the Senate? I do not know. Do not know. Probably not, would be my guess, but I'm not sure.
And I guess in terms of, was that the Senate was the only area you looked into in terms of, all those error rates, those dangerous
It was
error
the only one I looked into in any detail, although pretty much all the upper houses of our parliaments, including the Victorian Legislative Council, the New South Wales Legislative Council, and possibly others, are all pretty much the same story. If anything, you'd be lucky to get anything as detailed as a pretty picture out of them. And exactly the same concerns apply, and exactly the same solution should be mandated. In Victoria, you can't even get the electronic preferences out, so the very notion of an audit is kind of meaningless. But at least, but in New South Wales, you get the output data, so being able to audit the comparison between the paper ballots and the output data is a meaningful thing and should be done.
And in terms of like the application of like some of those like ideas that you mentioned or things that your team worked, what do you see as a resistance? Is it just, I mean, you mentioned one was the complexity of the whole thing that you tried it. Do you see that that's the main reason, or there's other things that makes it difficult for someone, experts like yourself and your team to go ahead and do the right thing?
Look, to be honest, I don't really know. I certainly haven't succeeded in persuading any of the electoral commissions that it's in their interests to run these sort of verification processes. I have done a lot of work in the United States and talked to a lot of different, both academics and election authorities in the United States. Obviously, the US is very, very diverse. And I guess there are so many zillions of different election authorities that you can get very different attitudes across the board. But a theme that comes out from the Americans, bearing in mind that these are the Americans willing to talk to an Australian geek, a theme that comes out from American electoral officials is that they protect themselves by transparently showing everybody that they're doing the right thing. And this is an enlightened attitude. It's exactly right? They protect themselves from the accusation of malfeasance or incompetence by running a transparent process that shows people they've done the right thing. I don't really understand why Australia's electoral authorities don't get that. There seems to be very much a tradition for electronic processes that they hide the electronic process, tell everybody that it's perfectly fine, and resist efforts to open it to scrutiny. I think it's a serious mistake. I don't think it's doing them any good, actually. It's not only not doing Australian democracy any good, it's not doing the Australian electoral authorities any good either. And I would really like to try to explain to them that if they run a transparent process that shows people that it's right, then that actually puts them in a much better position as well as us.
Okay, I mean, thanks so much. We actually went quite over time.
Yeah, we went a bit over time.
So
further questions are welcome. My email is easy to find, and
yeah, sure. The last thing is for anyone who would be interested to kind of explore these things in more detail, or any resources you would recommend, any books, any areas that for someone who wants to start looking into them.
There's a bunch of links on my website, both my Thinking Cybersecurity website and my new website. It depends what you're interested in. There's a bunch of links in the slides. So I would start there And if you have had a look at the links in the slides and you still want to look at more stuff, then emails and questions are welcome.
Sure, I should get a copy of that and share with everyone.
Yeah. There's read this fancy maths about faking no-vote decree from proof. All right, thanks everybody.
Well, thanks so much. Thanks everyone. And one last thing, if anyone would like to present at any of our upcoming meetups, please, yeah, you can find our CFP form on our website. And yeah, looking forward to your submission. And see you next month. Bye.